we have this wide-standing assumption that older adults don't have sex. So as soon as you reach 50, that's it, you're done. You never have sex again. We know this to be untrue.
From the USC Leonard Davis School of Gerontology, this is Lessons in Lifespan Health, a podcast about the science and scientists, improving how we live and age. I'm Professor George Shannon, Kevin Shute Chair in Gerontology. On today's episode, how Professor Paul Nash is challenging ageist stereotypes and shining a light on issues around sexuality among older adults. Paul Nash is an Associate Instructional Professor of Gerontology. He joins us today to speak about the importance of combating ageism and improving how we address intersectionality and the needs of LGBTQ and HIV-positive individuals in aging. Hi, Paul. Thanks for being here. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Thank you for that very, very warm welcome. It certainly was, let's just say, very, very generous of you.
I'd like to start by asking you about your work with the World Health Organization. Why did they elevate ageism as a priority area? And what is the aim of the work you've done with them?
Well, it's really interesting that you mentioned that because the World Health Organization have identified ageism as the last socially accepted form of prejudice. They've also highlighted that it is the least sensical version of prejudice as well, because essentially we're either all old or future old, therefore we're prejudicing against our future self. And when we look globally and having aging populations, especially as we reach structural aging in many countries now, then if we are living in an ageist society, if we're practicing ageist policies, etc., then we're going to be discriminating against larger swathes of the population. And we've already shown that has huge outcomes when it comes to health and well-being for older adults. But it also has implications for younger people as well. So we have to be really conscious that aging isn't something that happens when you reach 60 or 65, but it's something that happens across the life course. In terms of when we acquire ageist stereotypes, again, that can happen from as young as 6 years old. So we have to be really conscious about how we portray older adults and how that continues to perpetuate. So the work with the World Health Organization was looking at existing data sets from around the world. So we used data from around about 60 different countries. And we tried to map what was happening around the world. And there were some cultural differences, obviously. And there were some countries where there were areas of ageism that were, quote unquote, a bit worse than others. But generally speaking, what we saw were either explicit or implicit ageist traits in every single one of the countries.
So, as you say, we're all aging. And if we are going to in any way discriminate against those who are getting older, we're discriminating against ourselves, aren't we? So what are the specific consequences of ageism and who is impacted by them?
Well, there's some huge implications when it comes to ageism. So when we look on an individual level, we know that those people who have internalized ageism, so when they've acquired ageist attitudes across the life course and then they reach older age themselves and they start to internalize those negative perceptions, we know that people that do that tend to walk slower. They tend to be more unstable on their feet, more likely to fall. They also have reduced cognitive functioning. So we actually start to see these stereotypes, as we call them, embody. So we call it the stereotype embodiment theorem. And we know that older adults that have this more negative opinion of aging and being older themselves also have an average life expectancy that's about 7.5 years less than those people that have a positive attitude about aging. So there are huge implications, both psychologically and physiologically, when it comes to the individual. When we look at society, we know that older adults make a huge contribution to society. We're talking about billions of dollars a year in things like informal caregiving, even in terms of paid work, but also within the volunteer sector as well. So older adults make a continued service to society and to the economy, but it's often something that is not really discussed, and it's often something that's not really met. And when we start to prejudice against older people, we actually discriminate against their engagement in society. And as such, what we're doing is actually making things an awful lot worse for ourselves. So what we need to do is start to actively embrace older adults and their diversity and understand accurate perceptions of aging rather than these stereotype myths that are widely held.
So it's clear that we all age, but there are some groups who face more stigma than others. Can you explain the concept of intersectionality and how it affects older adults?
Yeah, no problem at all. And as you rightly said, we all age. Interestingly, we age in different trajectories. And by that, what I mean is we make decisions throughout our life course that differentiate ourselves from other people. And as such, think of it almost like a tree branch. And every time you make a decision, you're a bend in that tree branch. So the diversity of aging is absolutely huge because you've made a whole life course worth of decisions that differentiate yourself from other people. So that really helps us understand the differences in terms of experience. But when we look at intersectionality, this is generally around social categories and social categorizations that we either hold ourselves or that others can view of us. So the key ones that we see here are things like race, ethnicity, gender, socioeconomic status, and sexuality. So what we mean by this is somebody who is a white, cisgendered male is going to experience aging much differently to a transgender female, black gay person, for example. And what we mean by there is really when we're looking at the types of discrimination, the different types of prejudice that an individual experiences, they're often based on these social intersections. And really it's when we look at these multiple intersectionalities, as I mentioned before, around sexuality, around gender, around ethnicity, etc., that we can start to see how somebody's experience of aging is going to be totally different to that of a different group. And it's not just additive either. So it's not just, well, okay, you've got the ethnicity grouping, you've got the sexuality grouping, but they're also multipliers because people experience, for example, trauma and discrimination for being Black across their life course, similarly as they may do for being gay. But when we combine those, being Black and gay, for example, puts you on a minority footing in each of those other groups. So we have to look really like a giant Venn diagram of life to see where those different social categories intersect and what that means for the experiences of people within each of those categories.
So these challenges are compounded in a sense, particularly facing individuals like LGBT persons who have a greater likelihood of suffering, for example, from loneliness or depression. What are some of the biggest issues for this population?
Yeah, so what we see is we have to also think about this from a geopolitical perspective as well. So you look at the geopolitical perspective now, we've got marriage rights, we've got anti-discrimination policy, etc. So when we look at this from a historical perspective, the LGBT rights have changed dramatically. So today, for example, we have marriage equality, there are anti-discrimination laws, but 50 years ago, that just was not the case. Marriage equality was not even anywhere near the legislation books. And when we look at things like the DSM, so the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, homosexuality was actually considered a mental illness. So we have to think about how this has affected people expressing their own identity as they become older adults themselves and across their whole life course as well. Compare that to younger people now who are able to express that. We can start to understand some of the cumulative trauma that older adults have experienced. And that feeds into some of the challenges that are faced by older adults. Because of this being in the closet and hiding away, we know that the majority of older adults are within the LGBT community are likely to be single. They're also less likely to have a biological family, so children of their own, and they're also more likely to be estranged from their own family, which has led really to the development of what we call family of choice, which is really where people surround themselves by friends, and friends that basically take that role of family within your own life. But that can be kind of challenging unless we have intergenerational families or intergenerational families of choice, because it may be, for example, that a group of people of the same age all start to require support and help at the same sort of time. So we have to be very, very conscious of this. And then, as I mentioned before, with that intersectionality, when we look at how racism and sexism and homophobia has developed across the last 50 years, we can start to understand then why, for example, gay women of color, and especially trans women of color, are subject to the most forms of discrimination, which leads to problems in terms of accessing services because they don't have faith in healthcare services, in support services, in any formal structure. So we have to make sure that there are targeted health messages. We need to make sure that we are removing some of these intersectional barriers so that we can try and aim for a more equitable society.
Earlier, you mentioned doctors and other medical professionals and their reactions. What changes would you like to see in how they address sex and sexuality, particularly among older individuals?
Well, that's a huge minefield right there, George. One of the problems that we've got, and this really pervades through research as well, is we have this wide-standing assumption that older adults don't have sex. So as soon as you reach 50, that's it, you're done. You never have sex again. We know this to be untrue, but research and mostly policy also stops collecting data about older adults and their sexual health and their sexual behavior as well. So there's a lot of data that we just don't have on this population. So when it comes to sex and sexual health, what we need to do is make sure, one, we're engaging the older adult population and saying, well, we know you're having sex, but let's make sure we can do it in a safe way. We also need to make sure that sexual health screening is available for older adults because we have targeted interventions for youth groups, for hard to reach communities, but we don't have sexual health screening that goes around residential care, for example. And there's no reason why we don't do that. We also have to be very, very aware that older adults have different relationship styles. So gone are the days where every older adult is in the same relationship that they were in when they were 20 years of age. Indeed, now we're seeing increased divorce rates. We're seeing open relationships, polyamorous relationships, the same as we're seeing across other age groups as well. So we have to be very aware that, for example, condoms aren't just there to prevent pregnancy, but they're also there for sexual health. And we can take that across to, for example, HIV, where we see now that over 50%, nearly 60% of all those people living with HIV are older adults. And within this population, those are people over the age of 50. And that's been a real challenge, both in terms of healthcare providers, but also in terms of policy. So really what we need to do is open our minds and address some of these ageist assumptions that we have around older adults and actually start to work with older adults as well, rather than making these assumptions about this homogenous group, which is exactly the opposite. It's the most heterogeneous group that you're going to get, and actually work with them to understand some of these intricacies and understand some of these challenges that are being faced. So again, what we can do is try to make sure that these health messages are targeted and available for these specific groups.
For those of us who remember the apex of the HIV epidemic, it seems kind of miraculous that we've arrived at a place where people with HIV are able to simply grow old. Can you talk about some of the challenges around aging with HIV?
Yeah, so it's what we call a new aging population. So historically, as you mentioned, people who infected with HIV didn't live long lives. Now, with the new medications, the combined antiretroviral therapies that we have, people with HIV can live just as long lives as people without HIV. And this is because the viral suppression means essentially we have something called U equals U. Undetectable means that they can't transmit the virus through sex. And also, whilst people are living with a managed condition, it essentially becomes exactly like any other chronic disease. The only problem is the stigma around that. So again, we're going back to that concept of intersectionality. And we know, for example, that about 95% of older adults living with HIV have experienced either HIV stigma and or ageism. So we know that it is a huge problem. Similarly, when it comes to accessing services, Maybe, for example, somebody isn't able to leave their home. So maybe a service is no longer available to them. We have to also be aware that if you're an older adult living with HIV and, for example, you aren't virally suppressed, then again, we also can't stigmatize this group as well. So it's all very well and good having the U equals U, but there are some people that cannot reach viral suppression or undetectable viral loads. We have to make sure as well that we're working on these social interventions. We have to make sure that people have got that sense of community. So one of the problems that we have within the LGBT community is that there are very few quote unquote safe spaces. And these often revert around bars, around places, for example, that you might meet with loud music. And as an older adult, that might not necessarily be your ideal situation, especially if you're living with cognitive impairment, if you're living with visual impairment, or indeed issues with hearing as well. So we find that older adults often feel slightly isolated from these particular groups, which leads to larger issues with their social network, having reduced social networks, and indeed self-isolating. And we start to see then the problems around social isolation and loneliness that you mentioned earlier, George. And these are huge issues, not just within the LGBT community, but within the older adult population as well. But before we go down that rabbit hole, it is worth mentioning that older adults are not the most lonely in society. Actually, that is something that we can pass off to the younger generation, which arguably is partly down to that social comparison with social media.
Well, as you probably know, I was working in the arts for 30 or 40 years before I got into gerontology, and had many, many friends who are no longer with us and had shortened lives because of HIV. In fact, of all of my close friends, only one is still with us, and he lives right down the street from me. And it really is an amazingly awful fact that one has to adjust to in terms of, the fact that here he is being socially isolated and lonely and depressed. And I call him at least once a day just to kind of buck him up a little bit and cheer him up and talk to him and give him crack a joke and make him feel that that his life is worthwhile. He's a wonderful composer and artist himself. What kind of aging myths do you most want to bust?
Well, yeah, I'm just going to reflect back on what you're just saying there, George. And that is the case for a lot of people that survived the epidemic. Survivor guilt is a real huge problem where people are saying, well, hang on, why did all of my friends die and how come I have survived? And that, again, is another real issue when we're working with older adults who are living with HIV. And what we need to do is, like you said, be very aware of these social problems and try and challenge them, and also try and encourage people to be much more engaged and aware. When it comes to the wider social problems and the stigmas and things that I think we need to try and do is we need to be very much aware of our own language. And language, as you know, is incredibly powerful. So, for example, we might see ageist stereotypes in greeting cards, and we all have a bit of a giggle about that. But, well, that reinforces the stereotypes. That adds to the issues that older people think about, well, okay, I'm 60, I'm 70, I'm 80, well, I must have cognitive impairment as well. Indeed, what we need to do is start to challenge these stereotypes. We have this assumption, or we paint this mental image in our head that all older people are going to be frail and all older people are going to have cognitive impairment. That's just not true. The majority of older adults, even up to the age of 80, are not going to be living with cognitive impairment. It's a disease state. Yes, we understand that people who, as they age, are more likely to develop dementia, but the majority still don't. When it comes to frailty, frailty is also a syndrome. It is another disease state. Adults, yes, we know that we have decreased muscle strength as we age. But you know what? Engaging in exercise and weight-bearing exercise at that will help maintain muscle mass. So frailty is not synonymous with aging, yet it is something that we just talk about as they go hand in hand. So we need to be very, very careful of these stereotypes that we make assumptions that is true for every older person, not just because of that stereotype embodiment, but very similar to that section sexuality that we were talking about. If we make these assumptions that older people don't have sex, well, we're automatically cutting them off from research. we're automatically cutting them off from health services. So really, I think one of the key lines is something that we use very, very widely in the UK. When working with older adults, we should be saying nothing about us without us. We should have that participatory inclusion. Work with older adults. Don't make assumptions around them and what aging actually entails, when actually we've got these experts in the field, as it were, that are largely ignored from social policy and from research.
As you have suggested, aging is a lifelong process. So why is it important for young people to understand the consequences of ageist attitudes?
Well, let's face it, none of us want to see our parents deteriorate. None of us want to see our grandparents deteriorate. But actually, if we start to exhibit these ageist tendencies, or we talk down to our relatives, then we do start to see that stereotype embodiment. So we do start to see declines in cognitive and physical health. So we don't want to be perpetuating that. And as we talked about right at the start, ageism is essentially prejudice against your future selves. So if we set up an ageist society now, when we reach later life ourselves, then we're going to be living and growing old in that ageist society. So we need to start to challenge this. So younger people need to appreciate that actually having no wrinkles, having gray hair, or whatever, or having wrinkles and gray hair is not a bad thing. Being older is not a bad thing. When we start to see all these anti-aging serums, well, that's kind of a fallacy. It's not going to stop you from aging. Every moment that we're alive, we are aging. Therefore, really, the alternative to aging is death. And I don't think many people would like to wish that upon themselves either. So we need to start to embrace aging as an integral part of that life. So we need to look more accurately about what aging entails, and instead start to challenge some of these ageist stereotypes that we quite happily band about. So the way I present it to students, for example, is that if I was to run down the centre or a town centre and start shouting sexist or racist stereotypes, somebody would challenge me. But if I was to do the same about older adults, nobody really would. It's because that ageism is so pervasive and also globally accepted, and we really need to start to challenge that. So the World Health Organization launched their global campaign to end ageism, and that has really been adopted through things like the International Day of Older Adults, and also through a lot of academic research. But what we're really struggling with is that translation from academic research, moving research from that ivory tower and into the real world scenarios.
Teaching, learning, knowledge, understanding, all of that is important. What kind of a role can education play in breaking some of this stigma around aging?
See, education is integral. It is really, really important. It's a way in which we can challenge stereotypes. It's a way in which we can actually spread more accurate information. But education is not the be-all and end-all. We have to be able to implement this as well. We need to make sure that people are not just learning what the accurate information around aging is, but we find ways in which we can actually challenge that. And that's what we call the cognitive component of an attitude. That's the predisposition towards action. It's all really great knowing this information, but if we don't care enough to do anything about it, well, it just stays as information inside your head. What we need to do is try to encourage intergenerational contact. We need to encourage information sharing. So, for example, some of the best lessons I ever learned as a child were not from a textbook, but they were from my grandparents. They were lessons around life. They were life skills. And what we don't have now is that intergenerational skill sharing. So we need to try and encourage that. And we need to try and encourage accurate representations of aging, not just from an individual level, but wider as well. So we need to make sure that comedy sketches, for example, aren't concentrating on dementia, on feeble older stereotypes, but indeed are accurately representing older adults, the same way as we now don't use race or gender as the butt of jokes in comedy sketches. So we need to understand the wider concepts of age, and we need to understand the implications of perpetuating these ageist myths.
How true it is. One of the most annoying things that I find is when I watch something like Saturday Night Live and have them perform a sketch that degrades older adults. And I just turn to my wife and I just say, how do we change this? Why does this seem to be so self-perpetuating? Have you seen any positive developments that you can share with us?
So we do see some positive changes. So, for example, within the beauty industry, we have companies, I don't know if I can mention them, but like Dove, for example, have the campaign of Real Beauty, which start to show that actually we don't need to Photoshop everybody, that having gray hair, having curves, actually they're beautiful as well. It's about trying to make the stereotyped 20-something zero body fat no longer the norm. Because if you look around the world, it's not the norm. Actually, most people that are using these products are in their 30s, their 40s, their 50s, their 60s. So let's accurately represent that consumer group. So we're starting to see some very small steps in the right direction. Similarly, when we start to see representations of older adults in film and in TV, they are by no means accurately represented, but they're getting there. We're starting to see older adult leads. We're starting to see positive reflections of older people. So they're not just people living with dementia. They're not just stories around Parkinson's disease, but they're accurately presenting older adults as active within society, having an active role, having a sense of humor. So all of these things which are, you might just think, well, does that really matter? But yes, it does. If we start to paint older adults as human, then actually we can start to challenge these everyday microaggressions about ageism. We can start to challenge these everyday assumptions that ageism is a valid form of humor, when in actual fact, it just goes to offend people. The problem is that older people themselves often don't have the platform to say, actually, this is not acceptable. In the same way we see civil rights movements around gender, ethnicity, and sexuality, these are generally perpetuated and pushed forwards by younger people. So age is one of those protected characteristics that we do have as a protected characteristic, but it kind of gets left behind.
Maybe we just have to get angry.
We've made great strides in the disability movement, in the race equality movement, in the sexuality equality movement. So let's piggyback. Let's not try and reinvent the wheel and use some of these strategies that we've had to say, well, let's make age one of these protected characteristics that we're pushing forward, not necessarily just as an anti-ageism rhetoric, but actually within these communities as well. So again, going back to intersectionality, what about older Black people? What about older gay people? What about older women? Let's challenge some of these stereotypes that exist about these groups and really have an open dialogue.
You certainly covered a lot of material. Is there anything else that you can think of that you might want to add?
I think at this point is we all experience forms of ageism, whether it is somebody talking down to you about technology as an older person or making a joke about an older driver. What we really need to do is stop ourselves in our tracks. If we hear that, challenge it. If we say it ourselves, maybe correct ourselves as well. It's really something that you might think, oh, well, that doesn't really matter. But it's all those really small, oh, it doesn't matter, that make one really big kick in the teeth for an older population. So really what we have to do is start to challenge these assumptions whenever we face them. Ageism is not going away unless we have a concerted effort to actually challenge this.
Well, thank you, Paul. I think you've really challenged us to do something about it, not just to sit back and think that it's not important or that this too shall pass. It won't unless we aggressively tackle the issue and work to make it better. Thank you so much. Well, that wraps up this lesson in Lifespan Health. Thanks to Professor Paul Nash for his time and expertise, and to all of you for choosing to listen. Join us next time for another lesson in lifespan health, and please subscribe to our podcast at lifespanhealth.usc.edu. Lessons in Lifespan Health is supported by the Nash Center for Healthspan Science and the Center for Lifespan Health.